She was just a teenager trying to earn a little extra money, a responsible and warm-hearted girl who genuinely loved children and had built a small reputation in her neighborhood as one of the most reliable babysitters around. She had plans for that evening, things she had been looking forward to, but she set them aside because she had a commitment to keep. What happened next would shake an entire community to its core, send investigators down a winding and exhausting path, and ultimately lead to a courtroom reckoning that took nearly 4 decades to fully reach its conclusion. Karen Lattery was born on September 18, 1969 in New York City, the second child in a close-knit, deeply devout Catholic family. Her parents instilled in her a strong sense of faith, responsibility, and compassion from a very early age. She had an older brother who she looked up to, and the family shared a warmth that friends and relatives would later describe as genuinely rare. When Karen was just a year old, her family made the decision to relocate to Florida, eventually settling in the coastal community of Boynton Beach, a sun-drenched town in Palm Beach County, where the ocean air drifted through the neighborhoods and life moved at a pace that felt, on the surface, safe and familiar. Karen took to her new home quickly. She enrolled in a local Catholic school and threw herself into everything the school had to offer, joining the softball team, taking up swimming, and pursuing gymnastics with a focus and dedication that impressed her coaches. Because Boynton Beach sat right along the Atlantic coast, Karen and her close circle of friends spent much of their free time at the beach, soaking up the Florida sunshine and enjoying the kinds of carefree afternoons that seem, in hindsight, achingly precious. A few years after the family settled in, Karen was joined by a younger sister, and the bond between the two girls became one of the defining features of Karen's life. Her little sister idolized her, following her lead in sports, in school, and in the values she carried. Karen embraced that role naturally. She was someone people gravitated toward, someone who made others feel seen and cared for. At 14, Karen enrolled in her local high school, which operated a structured child care assistance program designed to connect responsible teenage girls with local families who needed temporary supervision for their young children. Families would submit requests to the school, and the school would match them with program participants who had completed basic training in child supervision and safety. For Karen, the program was a perfect fit. She already had real experience caring for her younger sister. She had a natural nurturing instinct, and she was excited by the opportunity to earn her own money for the first time. She signed up without hesitation and quickly distinguished herself. Families who worked with her raved about her maturity, her patience, and the genuine affection she showed for the children in her care. Requests for Karen specifically became so frequent that she rarely had an empty weekend. In addition to her babysitting work, Karen had developed into a serious competitive swimmer, talented enough that she had begun planning her academic future around the possibility of earning a college athletics scholarship. She was, by every measure, a young woman with a bright path ahead of her. On March 24, 1984, Karen was scheduled to babysit for a family she had worked with many times before. They had 2 young daughters and had come to trust Karen completely. Earlier in the week, Karen had briefly considered asking to be excused from this particular job. The weekend held other possibilities. One of her closest friends had recently moved to another state, and Karen had been trying to save enough money to buy a bus ticket to visit her during an upcoming school break. In the end, that very reason, saving for the trip, is what made her keep the commitment. The extra earnings mattered. Her mother drove her to the family's home that Saturday evening, and the parents greeted Karen warmly before heading out for the night. They reminded her, as they always did, to keep the doors locked, and then they left. For the next several hours, Karen and the 2 little girls had a completely ordinary and cheerful evening. They played games together, watched cartoons, shared dinner, and by around 9:30 that night, Karen had tucked both children into bed. With the house quiet, she returned to the living room and picked up the phone to call her best friend. The 2 girls chatted about their plans for the next day, excited because the father of Karen's friend had managed to get them tickets to a baseball game. After that call ended, Karen phoned another close friend who happened to be babysitting at a different home that same night. The 2 talked about how their evenings were going, sharing the small, ordinary details of their nights. Then Karen mentioned she was going to step into the kitchen to grab something to eat. She promised to call back in a few minutes. Her friend waited. The call never came. It was close to midnight when the parents returned home. As they pulled up to the house, the mother noticed immediately that the porch light was off. They had left it on deliberately, as they always did. The house itself was completely dark, which was unusual, and even the television, which Karen typically kept on as background noise, was silent. When they reached the front door, they found it unlocked. Thinking Karen may have simply forgotten, they stepped inside and called out her name. No answer. They walked toward the kitchen, and what they found there stopped them cold. On the kitchen floor was a large, deeply disturbing pool of evidence that something violent had occurred in that room. The telephone, which hung on the wall nearby, was dangling from its cord, as though it had been dropped mid-conversation. Leading away from the kitchen and down the hallway was a long, dark trail that drew their eyes toward the closed bedroom doors at the end of the hall. One door was their daughter's room. The other was the master bedroom, the parents' own room. A faint glow of light was visible beneath the second door. The father's mind raced. He feared what might be behind both doors. His wife, equally terrified, ran to the neighbors to call the police. The father stood in the hallway, paralyzed, unable to bring himself to open either door. A patrol officer arrived within minutes. He instructed the father to wait outside and moved carefully through the house. He opened the door to the girl's bedroom first and found both children exactly as Karen had left them, asleep in their beds, peaceful and physically unharmed. It was a moment of extraordinary relief, but it was fleeting. The parents told the officer that a teenage girl should still be somewhere in the house. He returned to the hallway, followed the trail of evidence to the second door, and opened it. Inside, on the floor of the master bedroom, he found Karen. He checked for a pulse. There was none. Additional officers and emergency personnel arrived quickly. Investigators soon confirmed what the initial scene had already suggested. Karen had been fatally wounded, her body bearing numerous injuries consistent with an attack involving a sharp instrument. Her clothing was partially in disarray, which immediately raised concerns about a possible assault prior to her death. A towel had been placed over her face. She was 16 years old. Detectives sealed the scene and began their work. A forensic examination of the home revealed several important details. A window in the living room had been left open by the family before they departed, and the protective screen over that window had been cut from the outside. In the soft earth beneath several windows along the side of the house, investigators found impressions left by boots, suggesting that whoever entered the home had first spent time outside, moving along the perimeter and watching the interior through the glass. There was also something unusual about how the intruder moved once inside. In addition to the boot impressions outside, investigators found barefoot impressions both outside and within the house itself. Their working theory was that the individual had removed his footwear before climbing through the window, likely to reduce sound and avoid leaving detectable prints on the floor. The front door, which the parents found unlocked upon their return, appeared to be the exit point. Investigators also discovered, in the dirt near the property, distinct impressions left by bicycle tires. The trail from those tire tracks led toward the road that ran along the coastline, where it eventually disappeared into the pavement. The physical evidence inside the house told a difficult story. Investigators found a hammer on the kitchen floor, covered in traces consistent with the violence that had occurred there. The hammer had not been brought into the home from outside. It had been taken from a storage cabinet within the house itself, indicating the attacker had either already known where to find it or had searched for it after gaining entry. A pair of women's gloves from the same cabinet were also missing, apparently taken by whoever had been in the home. Nothing of obvious monetary value had been stolen, which quickly led detectives to question whether robbery had ever been the motive. Medical examiners later determined that Karen had sustained 18 separate wounds from a sharp instrument, and those wounds were confirmed as the cause of her death. Examiners also confirmed that a serious assault had occurred and recovered biological material from the scene. However, in 1984, DNA analysis as a forensic tool was still in its infancy and not yet available to investigators in a meaningful way. One additional piece of evidence puzzled the team. A small piece of chewing gum was found adhered to Karen's shorts. Karen had recently had her braces removed and had reportedly been thrilled to finally be able to chew gum again. Investigators were not certain how the gum had ended up on her clothing, and some theorized that the attacker may have placed it there, though no definitive explanation was ever established. Law enforcement faced enormous pressure from a community gripped by fear. News of what had happened to Karen moved quickly through Boynton Beach, and parents reacted with immediate alarm. The idea that a violent predator might be operating in their neighborhoods, targeting young babysitters, was almost too frightening to process. Families stopped letting their children go anywhere without an adult companion. The school's child care program underwent a serious overhaul almost immediately. Where before teenage girls would go alone to supervise children in other families' homes, new safety guidelines now encourage participants to work in pairs, to double-check every window and door before settling in for the evening, and even suggested that families might consider bringing children to the sitter's home rather than sending a lone teenager into someone else's house. The entire community was operating under a shadow it had never experienced before. Police attempted to interview the two young girls who had been asleep in the house that night, hoping they might have seen or heard something. One of the children mentioned that she had been frightened in the night by a man with something on his face, but she was too young to provide any useful description beyond that. Investigators also examined the parents of the children Karen had been watching. Some community members had already begun to speculate privately that the family might somehow be involved, given that the crime had occurred in their home, and that they were theoretically the last people to see Karen before the attack. Those suspicions intensified briefly when the family relocated to another state just 2 days after the incident. Detectives followed up, reviewed the couple's alibi carefully, and ultimately concluded that there was no credible evidence connecting them to Karen's death. They later made a public statement to that effect in an attempt to quiet the speculation. A reward fund was quickly organized by friends, neighbors, and community supporters who wanted to help bring the responsible party to justice. The initial pool of money grew rapidly, eventually reaching $50,000, a substantial sum that generated thousands of telephone tips to the police department. Officers worked to follow up on every lead, but the volume was staggering, and many of the calls pointed back to the same unfounded suspicion about the family, a theory investigators had already ruled out. Meanwhile, another potential lead briefly generated excitement. An officer working a completely separate case involving a break-in at a nearby residential trailer tracked down a suspect who traveled by bicycle. When the bicycle was examined, one of the handles appeared to have a reddish substance on it, and investigators also found a piece of chewing gum on the bike, which seemed like it could be the same color as the gum found on Karen's clothing. Both items were sent to the lab. The results came back disappointing. The substance on the handle was ordinary paint, not blood, and the gum turned out to be a different flavor entirely. That lead evaporated. Investigators also revisited the physical evidence using new technology. A neighboring law enforcement agency had recently acquired an advanced fingerprint analysis device, far more sensitive than anything previously available, capable of detecting prints on surfaces that older methods would have missed entirely. Detectives borrowed the equipment and returned to the scene of Karen's death to go over every surface again. They recovered dozens of prints that had previously gone undetected. After careful analysis, however, all of them were traced back to the family and their known associates. There were no unidentified prints of evidentiary value. The case stretched on through the months, absorbing investigative resources while generating no meaningful break. That year happened to be a record-setting period for violent crime across the region, placing extraordinary demands on the department and making it even more difficult to sustain the level of focus this one case required. Then on May 29, the investigation found itself confronted with a second tragedy. Police were called to a home located only a few miles from where Karen had been attacked, and there they discovered the body of 38-year-old Georgina Warren, a mother, found in her own bedroom. A pillow had been placed over her face. A hammer was found nearby. The house showed signs that the attacker had entered through a window and had later used the shower before leaving. Georgina's 2 daughters had been asleep in the house during the attack and had heard nothing. Medical examiners confirmed she had been fatally assaulted and recovered biological material from the scene that could potentially be matched to a suspect in the future. Investigators could not overlook the unmistakable similarities between this crime and what had happened to Karen 2 months earlier. The same type of entry, the same concealment of the victim's face, the same weapon type, the presence of children who remained unharmed, the attacker's use of a shower, and the absence of fingerprints. Every investigator in the room understood they were almost certainly dealing with the same individual. This time, however, a crucial piece of trace evidence emerged. Next to Georgina's bed lay a book, and when forensic technicians subjected each page of that book to analysis using the high-sensitivity fingerprint device, they discovered a single partial print on one of the interior pages. It did not match anyone in the household. There were no interconnected fingerprint databases at that time, but investigators now had something tangible to compare against any future suspect. They also uncovered an additional detail connecting the two cases. One of Karen's close friends had been watching Georgina's children just a few days before the attack on Georgina, suggesting that whoever committed these crimes may have been tracking and selecting his victims by observing the routines of babysitters and the families they served. Detective Kevin McCoy, one of the lead investigators working these cases, had been developing a broader theory. He suspected that the same individual responsible for the 2 killings had also been active in a pattern of escalating incidents across the area. The attacker's apparent familiarity with forensic concepts, his discipline in avoiding fingerprints, his use of footwear removal, and his ability to move without attracting attention all pointed to someone with experience, someone who had been doing this for a while. McCoy thought back to a case he had investigated about a month before Karen's death, a deeply troubling incident in the nearby city of Boca Raton, in which an unknown man had entered a young woman's bedroom while she slept, struck her with a heavy object, removed some of her clothing and a ring, and then left. The woman survived, but the injuries she sustained left her with lasting neurological effects, and she was unable to provide investigators with any useful description of her attacker. McCoy had not been able to solve that case, but he now believed it was connected. He also pulled records from a series of incidents that had occurred on May 22, 2 months after Karen's death. Late that night, a woman and her adult son had returned home and discovered a man in the process of cutting a window screen and attempting to enter a nearby residence. The son pursued him on foot, but the man reached his bicycle and began to escape. The son caught up with him and managed to bring him to the ground. A brief physical struggle followed before the intruder wrenched himself free, sprinted to a nearby canal, and jumped in, swimming away in the darkness. Left behind were not only his bicycle but also his sneakers, which he had removed and left beneath the window before attempting to enter the home. 2 days later, a woman in the same general area was jolted awake by a blow to the head and screamed out, causing the intruder, who was still in the room, to bolt and flee through the front of the house. That same evening, in a different home, a woman was sitting quietly when a man burst into her room. She screamed, and again the man fled without completing whatever he had intended. A similar incident occurred days afterward, when a man entered a home and startled its occupant so severely that she cried out, sending him stumbling backward and into the family's pool, from which he climbed out and disappeared into the night. McCoy was convinced these events were not coincidental. They were the work of the same person, someone who was escalating, someone who lived in or near Boynton Beach and was growing bolder. He also began looking into a series of complaints filed by female students at a nearby university. Multiple women had reported encounters with a man who had exposed himself on campus grounds and, in some instances, had found his way into their dormitory buildings. Each woman described the man similarly: a white male of medium height, short dark hair, and a lean build. Officers had assembled a composite sketch based on those descriptions. McCoy took that sketch and settled in with a large binder of booking photographs for individuals with prior convictions for offenses of a sexual nature. He went through every page slowly and methodically. One photograph drew his attention. The man in it bore a significant resemblance to the composite sketch. McCoy assembled a photo lineup, mixing the suspect's image in with several others, and brought it back to one of the university students who had reportedly gotten the clearest look at the intruder. She studied the photographs carefully, then pointed to one. She was certain. The man in that photograph, she said, was the one who had entered her dormitory. The man she identified was 20-year-old Dwayne Owen. His criminal history was already notable, including multiple arrests for theft, public indecency, and assault. That history was sufficient legal grounds to seek him out for questioning, but investigators quickly discovered that Owen's whereabouts were unknown. Detective McCoy issued an alert and circulated Owen's photograph to patrol officers throughout the city. Within days, the break came from an unexpected direction. An officer on routine patrol spotted a man whose appearance closely matched the circulated photograph. She stopped him and asked for identification. The man handed her a military identification card bearing the name Dana Brown. Something felt wrong to the officer. The document looked unusual, and the man standing before her looked very much like the person in the photograph she had memorized. She detained him and transported him to the station. A fingerprint comparison confirmed it immediately. The man was Dwayne Owen, and the identification card was fraudulent. Owen was taken into custody on charges related to the false document, which gave investigators the legal window they needed to hold him while they worked to establish his connection to the killings. During the interrogations that followed, investigators made headway on the separate incidents almost immediately. Owen admitted that the bicycle and sneakers left behind at the canal side scene were his. He also acknowledged involvement in several residential break-ins. But when the conversation turned to the two killings, he denied any connection and remained evasive, clearly enjoying the dynamic of the interrogation room. Investigators described him as someone who spoke in riddles, who toyed with their questions, and who seemed energized by the attention. He was questioned for dozens of combined hours across multiple sessions. Then, in one exchange, when investigators asked him directly whether he had ever taken a life, Owen paused and said simply, yes. He offered no details. When pushed on how many times, he said nothing at all, but he reached forward and drew a figure on the surface of the table with his fingertip, the number 2. He also told detectives that he had studied forensic science and understood how investigations worked, which he offered almost as a kind of explanation for why he had been so difficult to catch. In the meantime, investigators had submitted Owen's fingerprints for comparison against the partial print found on the page of the book recovered from Georgina Warren's bedroom. The result came back as a match. When detectives returned to the interrogation room and presented Owen with this news, he received it calmly, even with a trace of a smile. He acknowledged that he had probably touched the book on the nightstand during the course of the crime. Shortly afterward, he began to talk in earnest. Owen confessed to both killings, walking investigators through each event with a level of detail that left no room for doubt. In the case of Georgina Warren, he described how he had planned the entry, what he had done inside the home, and how he had prepared for the crime in advance, even bringing a change of clean clothing stored on his bicycle so that he could change out of his blood-stained clothes before riding away. For Karen's case, he described how he had been cycling through the neighborhood on the evening of March 24, 1984, when he spotted her through the living room window from the street. He estimated the time at around 8 in the evening. Rather than acting immediately, he rode to a nearby bar, had a drink, and sat for a period of time before returning to the house as darkness fell. He watched through the windows for a while, then removed his socks and pulled them over his hands to avoid leaving fingerprints on the window frame before climbing through. Once inside, he concealed himself in a closet, where he found the hammer and the women's gloves. When Karen walked into the kitchen and picked up the telephone, Owen became frightened. He convinced himself that she had noticed something and was calling the police. He emerged from hiding and attacked her. After committing the crime, he carried Karen to the master bedroom. He then showered, gathered everything he had brought and everything he needed to remove, and exited through the front door. The knife he had carried into the home, the weapon responsible for the wounds Karen sustained, he took with him when he left. He rode to the ocean, threw the knife into the water, and returned home. At home, he found both his roommates already awake, and in a calculated attempt to establish a false alibi, he secretly moved the hands of the wall clock back by 2 hours before making enough noise to get their attention. Both roommates looked up and saw the clock reading an earlier time than it actually was, meaning that if police ever questioned them about Owen's whereabouts, they would unknowingly provide an alibi built on a lie. Owen was formally charged with both killings and held while awaiting trial. As investigators dug deeper into his background, a picture emerged of a deeply troubled and fractured upbringing. He had been raised in a severely unstable household by parents who struggled with addiction, and after their home environment became untenable, Owen and his brother cycled through a series of foster placements. As a young adult, Owen had enlisted in the military for a brief period before pursuing coursework in forensic science at a local college. He later admitted that he had genuinely wanted to become a law enforcement officer, and that a prior criminal conviction had closed that door for him. He described his decision to pursue a life of crime as a deliberate response to being shut out of the career he had wanted, though investigators and psychologists involved in the case viewed that explanation with significant skepticism. In the course of preparing the case, prosecutors also learned that Owen had confessed to dozens of other incidents, including instances of voyeurism, indecent exposure, and unlawful entry, going back years. He insisted, however, that Karen and Georgina were the only two people whose lives he had taken. While the legal system prepared its case, Owen himself briefly threatened to derail the proceedings by attempting an escape from the detention facility where he was held. He managed to conceal himself inside a large waste container, apparently hoping that it would be collected and removed from the facility. Correctional staff discovered him before the attempt could succeed. The trial for Karen's killing began approximately 1 year after his arrest. Owen entered a plea of not guilty, and his defense team argued aggressively that his confessions had been extracted through improper interrogation tactics and that his constitutional rights had been violated. The defense specifically pointed to several moments during the recorded interrogations where Owen had indicated he did not want to continue speaking, arguing that investigators had not honored those invocations of his right to remain silent. These were serious constitutional arguments, and the court gave them careful consideration. However, once the full recordings of Owen's confession sessions were played for the jury, the weight of his own words proved overwhelming. The jury returned a verdict of guilty, and Owen was sentenced to death. The following year, he received the same sentence in connection with Georgina Warren's killing. Additional sentences for the string of other offenses were added to his record, ensuring that under any circumstances, he would never again be free. What followed was a prolonged legal journey that tested the patience and resolve of the victims' families across multiple decades. Owen filed an appeal in the Karen case, focusing on the same argument his defense team had raised at trial, that investigators had continued questioning him after he had indicated he wished to stop talking. In a development that stunned many observers, the appellate court sided with Owen, and the convictions related to Karen's death were vacated. The prosecution appealed in turn, and the legal battle stretched on for years. 7 years after the original verdict was overturned, a retrial was conducted. The evidence was presented again, the recordings were played again, and once more the jury found Owen guilty. He was again sentenced to death. For nearly 4 decades, Owen remained on death row in Florida, the passage of time doing nothing to diminish the weight of what he had done. The families of both women lived with that weight every day. Corinne's younger sister, the little girl who had idolized her older sibling and modeled herself after her in so many ways, grew into an adult and eventually chose a career in law enforcement. She became a sheriff's deputy, a path she later connected directly to the loss of her sister, describing how Corinne's death had created a restlessness in her that she eventually channeled into a commitment to protecting others. She spoke of suffering from sleeplessness in the years after Corinne died, of lying awake with grief and questions, and of eventually finding a way to transform those feelings into something purposeful. Owen's execution was formally scheduled for June 15, 2023, nearly 4 decades after the crimes were committed. Corinne's sister was present that day. She had come to witness the conclusion of a case that had defined so much of her life. She wanted to look Owen in the eyes in those final moments. He kept them closed until the end,